Okay, let's two quick comments before I take any questions about Surah al Rahman, because one is, of course, you notice that the surah starts with the singularity and the unity of Ar-Rahman, for lack of better word, we'll just translate it as the merciful. Because the Rahman, the word Rahman encompasses mercy, compassion, love, intimacy, empathy. It's an extremely nuanced, rich word. But notice that it starts out with this singularity, this tawheed, this oneness. And then when it breaks into the duality necessary for justice and accountability and consequence and it maintains it throughout until the surah ends with a return to the singularity again, to tawheed again. So, as many of the scholars of Islam have said, when all is said and done, it is only a singularity and an essential unity to all of existence in God and from God and because of God and to God. And that's, the minute you as created beings, the duality is made necessary because we are there's a space between us and God. And this is important because it's like, as I said before, this surah is like other surah in the Quran. It's like a symphony, and part of the symphony is that you start with the Rahman, and then you break into this narrative of duality, and then you end with the conclusion that comes to the singularity again. The other thing was something Sharif said, reminded me of something that I once heard about Surah al Rahman, which I had actually, to be honest, had forgotten throughout this whole tafsir until something that Sharif said sparked it. One of the recommendations or nasiha that I got about Surah al Rahman was every time I repeat فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ to breathe deeply before I do so, to take a deep breath and to then recite it. Now later on in life, and especially after doing the khalwa for 21 days, you learn, and this is part of what I was sort of thinking and what I was stuttering about because I was censoring myself about, and I will continue to do so, but I'll just tell you a little bit. There are two necessary elements for your journey towards the divine, other than the things that you can think of normally. Water is a purifying agent, and breathing is an essential instrumentality, and learning to breathe and learning to purify. And they aid you enormously in getting over your physiological dependence, and even in getting over, because as the more you journey, the more Allah challenges you and with physical ailments and health problems, and to even learn to get beyond the limits of physical pain. But that's a very big subject, and if you went into training, if you decided to dedicate big part of your life into that. You will find a lot of shuyukh that will insist that before you memorize Surah al Rahman that they teach you how to do salah while breathing properly and wash and purifying properly. Just so, well, it's as I always say, the Islamic tradition is endlessly rich and nuanced, and God gave you the intellect so that you can avoid the trap of dependency on anyone or being fooled by anyone. And if you use it judiciously and you truly worship no other human being and refuse to worship no other human being, then you're on safe grounds. And most people that are deceived by other human beings, there's something intuitively in them that had warned them from the very beginning, but they just didn't listen to it. So learning to listen to your inner voice, that fitrah in you that warns you, is also essential. This was not a question, but I want to, a lot of graduate students ask me before they start their graduate studies, give me advice. Well, of course, there's a lot of advice you can give graduate students, but I think a lot of graduate students Muslim graduate students are very surprised when I tell them my biggest advice to you is no matter what happens, never stop praying. In other words, do your salah and do it, struggle with yourself to do it with great care. Journeys of the intellect are liberating, but they are also, if your ego gets too big, because a lot of things in the academia are designed to inflate your ego artificially. It's like practicing in a court of law. Why is it that we stand up when a judge comes in? Why do we say your honor? Why do we... There are certain protocols that are designed to create to leave an emotional impact of sacredness and magnanimity, and it's fine. You can do it as long as you are cognizant of the reality and the truth of things, so that you actually don't believe the judge is an honor. When you say your honor, you don't think that this is a superhuman, but actually just a human being like you. Academia similarly has the same type of its own rituals that are designed to obfuscate and to the intellect is liberating as long as you remain grounded and anchored. I'm saying this in response to some things that have come up, but okay, having said this, I'll let you ask your questions. I know that there are a lot of questions also on the net that came through.
Can we start, do you want to start with Surah al Rahman, or do you want to go to the follow-up from the last Halaqa about Shahab Ahmed's book?
Yeah, the comments I made about Shahab Ahmed's book seem to have raised up a lot of controversy. I really don't, all I'm going to say about Shahab Ahmed's book is, for me, Sharia is core to Islamic normativity. And whether you realize it or not, my issue is not with Shahab Ahmed. He's now with God. May Allah forgive him for. My issue is with anything that attempts to deconstruct canon without thinking carefully about what canon it's proposing instead. And whether you realize it or not, Shahab Ahmed's project was a normative project of deconstructing canon and replacing it with another canon. And the canon it wanted to propose as an alternative is a canon based on empirical experimentation, or what he calls exploration. The entire thing of context, pretext, text is to me, the way he unfolds this whole discussion is extremely unhelpful and falsely glamorous. It caters to the egos of graduate students, people who don't know the Islamic tradition well. If you actually read Ikhwan al-Safa and Najm al-Din al-Tusi and al-Farabi and Ibn Sina and so on, you know the ways that they are being forced into a normative discourse that is abusive. Anyway, if you want to know what I think, read Reasoning with God. If you don't want to know what I think, you're free. I mean, I don't care if you read. If you want to love Shahab Ahmed's book, no. At the end, we all face God, and we all are accountable for our own things. And as we said, Surah al Rahman. So we're all limited to the consequences of our actions. And, that's all I'm going to say about that whole thing.
How old was he?
He was my age. When he passed away, he was in his 40s.
He was sick? Or?
He got sick all of a sudden. It was all over and within a couple of months. Diagnosed until he passed away. It was very tragic. But, I mean, he was, when in our wedding, we had a very private wedding. We had invited practically no one. But he was invited, so that tells you how close we were.
I watched them.
So it's a personal journey with in which I saw a very good friend go down a path that I strongly disagree with. And by the way, and it's not about just drinking alcohol, because so why don't we stop with drinking alcohol? Well, I mean, if you accept the normative discourse of, okay, you made drinking alcohol, so, and if you say deconstruct the 5 pillars of Islam and it's only the Shahada, and we don't need, and Sharia, they're legal supremacists, as Shahab says about people like me, that we're legal supremacists and so on, then, fornication, adultery, usury, I mean, what happens to the entire corpus of law? I'll leave it at that. People can do whatever they want to do, whatever yeah.
And so, it's okay if we go back to Rahman?
Yeah.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first verses of the surah that paint a picture of creation, deals with creation. Then it ends with كل من عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام. And then the surah, the entire surah ends with something very, yeah, except it's the name. So is there anything in tradition, or is there anything that you have to say about this repeating kind of trend of, and also why end with the face of your Lord and then at the end with the name of your Lord? What's the implied difference between these?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. The whole, the only thing I recall, and I didn't. I mean, every time we have the Halaqa, I start. You chase certain lines of certain, it's like discourses, they go into particular offshoots, and then you start chasing them through certain texts, and especially Risala fi. So, but I couldn't relocate this because I know it's in one of the manuscripts that you got. Who was it? Did you work on it? The manuscripts are bound and printed.
Oh no, that was Faisal.
That was Faisal. Where is Faisal? Oh, he's at Hajj. He's at Hajj.
He should be back.
There is a risala. There is a risala that is just written on why the Quran and what does it mean when Allah says "Wajhu Rabbika." So, and what is the difference between Wajhullah and Haqiqatullah, and especially the sifat, so one is the face of your Lord and the essence and the attributes of your Lord. Now this of course goes into this entire much bigger debate of the essence and attributes versus a face, and whether what manifests through the materiality of existence, so what manifests on life on this earth is the attributes of the Lord and the essence of your Lord, or simply resonances of the essence and the attributes of your Lord. Now, because I've read this about 20 years ago, I was trying to find it again and reread it, just in case this exact question came up. Someone asked me about the face of your Lord, but I couldn't locate it at the time that I had. So I'm answering from memory. And what I remember about the arguments according to this Risala, which maybe if we bother Facebook enough, we'll be able to relocate the actual physical copy. I couldn't find it on the computer. Is whether it's, to simplify things, whether it's an indication or an emphasis that the entire existence that unfolds in material existence, it has no truth. It is as if existing in the realm of shadows and subjective beliefs and subjective perceptions of consciousness, but it has no absolute truth in itself, entire material existence. And that why when Allah describes material existence, concludes it or sums it with the face of your Lord, as opposed when Allah describes the entire journey, which includes the hereafter, Allah then refers to the truth of your Lord. Now, of course, as I'm summarizing this, I know that I'm forgetting a lot, but the Risala was about 30, 40 folios, and for a folio is, I don't know how many pages. If you print it out, about 5 pages. So, about 150 pages, if it got edited and printed someday, and it went into a lot of very fascinating details. That would be, by the way, because it's an unpublished Risala, and I initially downloaded it from Mustafa, what is it called? That is it Mustafa? The Saudi one. We had a copy of that Risala, the manuscript. But then I went back, because I had printed it and bound it, and then I was trying to find it, I couldn't locate it again, so they might have removed it. I looked it up by the number, but I don't know.
Do you remember who the author was?
I know that it was something Asfahani, so he was Persian, or a Persian origin, but he wrote it in Arabic. But which Asfahani, because there's several Asfahanis. I don't remember. I just ran out of time. I can find it. I'll search for it and find it, inshallah. anything about the Rahman, so
We'll finish it.
yeah.
Okay,
You're in
start
charge,
from-
because I'm actually have my eyeglasses off so I can't see anything.
Sure.
Go ahead,
But all
Rob.
of you are just one big,
One big order.
you know, I can't even tell the difference between a man and woman without my eyeglasses.
Let's do
Or a
this.
human and alien.
Let's go around and just to save time, everyone ask their question and then the professor can answer it as he will. So go ahead, Rob.
My question was the one I had last week. I forgot my notebook today, so I can't remember which specific verse it was on, but you were mentioning how preparing yourself and how you would be proportionally rewarded in the hereafter to the extent that you prepared yourself. And my question was on the sort of two different paths that Al-Ghazali and others have talked about, the path of falsafa, or philosophy, or reason, and the path of tasawwuf, and how he mentioned, and Al-Ghazali talks about how the path of reason is more challenging and is not meant for everyone, but it ultimately leads you to something more certain, like something higher, and the path of tasawwuf is something that the common person can participate in, and it ultimately leads you to the same destination, but to a lesser degree. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, can I?
Should we go now?
Let me, because this was from last Halaqa, so
Okay.
and I didn't get to it. Let me just. Of course, what is really interesting is that the third school of thought, the one that consistently understood references to Jinan as as a non-material reward, in other words, a revelation of truth and so on. They seem to always emphasize the element of how much you, how close the relationship you achieve to the Lord through self-disclosures, i.e. through futuh, so which connotes nearly exclusively the second path, the Sufi path. But of course then that brings the theoretical question, well, they might have always assumed that they're talking to people who are traveling through the second path, not the first path. But theoretically, and because when you asked that question, I was thinking about what I believe. Granted, most of the people that I remember reading always assume that it is the second path, and they don't really say anything about the first path. If you ask me theoretically, I theoretically do not exclude the possibility of either path. However, my experience has made me very skeptical about the possibilities of the first path. In fact, throughout my life, I only know one person that I can say I am convinced has actually attained knowledge of the divine through the first path. Now, this might be because I'm a product of my day and age, and we see the products of reason often deals with the capability to engage in sort of an unadulterated rational processes, and that takes you to the divine is was a state of philosophical thinking today is extremely difficult. I personally, although as a young man, I tended to embrace reason as the beginning and the end. I grew with age, and of course was getting closer to death. Because as you age, you just get closer to death by the nature of things. And also, I've seen the product of what people who seem to be very philosophically advanced, but yet spiritually blind, so consistently. So there's only one person in my entire life that I've met who I've actually considered to have reached levels of enlightenment through. So, but that's just me. Now, of course, I think if you ask Ghazali that same question, he would not exclude the first path, but would just again warn you that it's so difficult, and it's full of smoke and mirrors, and it full of deceptions, and it seems to have gotten more so with modern systems of knowledge. So, yeah, I mean, it's a part of the reason that I skipped it last week, is I wanted to think about it, and when I was since you asked it, I was thinking of all the people that I've met, and well, I've met a lot of people who their reason has really wasted them. They ended up just messes. Yeah. But I do know one person that just is, but also, it's also intelligence. I mean, God-given IQ. This person is just, I mean, his ability to even understand mathematical equations, extremely complex mathematical equations that just in a glance, a level of reasoning that is just really superhuman. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's when I have to control my envy, because I get very jealous. Every time I've been around this guy, I just always, I have to go rebalance and recalibrate my mizan again, because it's like, Allah, why didn't you give me that?
He used a little bit more of his brain.
Okay, so let's go around and ask.
Okay.
So Soraya, you had a question. And
Yeah, actually, it's not really a question, it's an observation with a question mark. When Sharif says, why at the end, God says, the face of God, right? Wajhu Rabbika. So at the beginning, when he said Ar-Rahman, we translate it like merciful, but I think it doesn't even have a real translation, because Rahim can be merciful, but Rahman, you can be Rahim, I can be Rahima, but we cannot be Rahman, only God can be Rahman. So it's like an ultimate kind of mercy. And then we go at the end, we see the face of God glowing with generosity and bounty. So it seems to me Rahman is the face of God glowing with generosity, Dhul Jalali wal Ikram. So I don't know if this is correct or not, the way I think, or the way I see it.
do you want to read this?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Hud. Did you want to, we're going to like have everyone say their question.
Yeah, so I guess I tried to ask this and I wasn't that articulate last time, but when we're talking about these like two levels of heaven and those who are seek the divine or seek some kind of the ultimate divine knowledge versus those who are just kind of like satisfied with the fulfilling the doing what's good and or have good and bad and things like that. So each of us individually, again, are kind of like born in circumstance and are given some kind of innate abilities, and it seems kind of like a predestination for some set of a population that's going to be going towards the divine seeking, and the other population that's going to be going to that second level of heaven. And so there's something of a predestination in there, and that's what's kind of hard to kind of like reconcile mentally somehow for me. And if I can just add another question, the notion of Rahman being the ultimate merciful, and the notion of an eternal heaven, an everlasting heavenly state, and an everlasting punishing place. I guess I can conceptually accept the everlasting heavenly place, but for people that, or jinn or whatever, that are going to be punished eternally for a defined period of sin. So in other words, their existence is, it's a speck in time, so to speak, compared to this eternal punishment for a defined period of sin, let's say. It seems a little bit irreconcilable, if I may use that word, of a Rahman who has ultimate mercy, but yet will punish eternally somebody for a defined 70 years, 50 years, or whatever of sinning. That's always confused me.
Anyone else have a question?
Are we keeping it at questions about Surah al-Rahman? Or, I don't know what you mentioned.
No, let's get done with Surah al Rahman
Okay,
first,
and then we'll go
take
to the
other
rest.
questions.
Okay.
I have a question regarding the 3 layers of interpretation for the last 12 verses, basically about the heavens. So if I were to look back, watch the video again, I know there's like paradise level A and paradise level B. So does the first layer, the second layer, and the third interpretation of the layer is actually connected to one particular one? For example, the first one is for the second level, for people who basically do good deeds and then do bad deeds at the same time in this earth. And then is the third layer is actually specifically referring to the first layer for people who passionately seeking the face of God in this earth, who busy themselves at all the times, or just one particular verse refers to paradise level B, and then one particular verse refers to paradise level A? Or what's the question?
Yeah. Okay, let me go back a little bit. So the first thing about the question that she phrased, he was referring to at one point when Allah's talking about the end of life on earth, and then the comment of Surah al Rahman is وَلَا يَبْقَى إِلَّا وَجْهُ رَبُّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ. And then at the end of the surah, the only thing that will remain after life on earth is extinguished, and the atf here is the only thing that will remain on earth is only the face of your Lord, of the most beautiful and the most complete or perfect, or the most bountiful. At the end of the surah, it says, "Tabarak ismu rabbuka dhul jalali wal ikram." That so the contrast is when it talks about the end of life on earth, it references the face of your Lord. And when it talks about the summation of the entire narrative of life on earth and the hereafter, it says the name of your Lord, not the face of your Lord. Otherwise, the two verses, the two ayat are exactly parallel. But the only contrast is the face of your Lord versus the name of your Lord. And so what I was saying is that is regarding that contrast. Why does it say the face of your Lord versus the name of your Lord at the end of the surah? The second thing about the levels and so on, I mean, you know, it's interesting because some of what actually sort of became in the modern age the most popular position, or the ones that are adopted by ministries of education and taught in public schools in countries like Egypt, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi, is not that there are two levels of heaven, but rather that there is a heaven. Of course, now, before I say that, there's a caveat. That remember that some would say that there is a heaven for human beings and there is a heaven for jinn, and that when it talks, but when it talks about two layers of heaven, that the position that is taught and repeated is that the higher heaven is for the mutaqaddimin, the earlier generations, the generations of the Prophet and the Sahaba, and that the lower heaven will be for the mutaakhirin, the loser generations, including us. Now that, interestingly, was the minority position in a lot of the tafsirs that you read written in the idea that what the higher heaven is for the early generations and the lower heaven is just for later generations, because by definition the higher generations are much better than the later generations, was referenced in a lot of tafsirs, but it was always referenced as sort of one opinion that they would quickly pass on to. It's very interesting that in the modern age that position became adopted and taught as nearly the exclusive position, which I'm not a sociologist, but if sociologists want to study why, I mean, of course, I can't resist saying that it's also a position preferred by the Wahhabis. Is it a coincidence that Saudi Arabia happened to say that that's the position that by definition all the early generations are in the higher heaven, all the later generations? It's also consistent with another Wahhabi theme, which, by the way, tends to play a role in Saudi politics in some very devastating ways, that towards the end of days, Islam, I'm sure all of us heard of this before, that Islam returns a foreign religion, and that people will leave the faith in masses. So if you check the Saudi governmental trolls that are arguing that we should do nothing about Jerusalem, and that the Judaizing of Jerusalem and the whole Palestinian thing and so on, they say, well, that's the way Allah wants it. That Islam is on the retreat, everyone is going to be leaving the faith, and we are going to lose Jerusalem. So the logic of defeat is preordained by Allah, as predicted by the Prophet and Kitab al-Fitan, and it's very, I mean, that answers the question why it's the position preferred by the Wahhabis, because it's that defeatist narrative. Which, by the way, because you're going to Princeton, you once asked me why do I insist that on a forward trajectory and that it is possible for Muslims to achieve what they've never achieved in the past? I picked it up from Princeton because I was at Princeton once was Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, and they were talking about the Kutub al-Fitan. And Patricia Crone said, you know, Muslims by nature are a defeatist people because they read Kutub al-Fitan and they want, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Prophet predicted that Muslims are going to end up losers, and so they will embrace the defeatist psychology, and you know, of course there is no forward trajectory for Muslims, and she said it in a very arrogant way as well. I mean, she was such a wonderful person. I'm kidding. She was sort of, and from that day forward, I decided to go back and research the whole rise of the Fitan literature, and I vowed never to be a defeated Muslim. So I forced myself to believe in a cheerful, forward-looking trajectory, even when my genetic makeup is one of a pessimist, as Khalid, because that circles back, that hooks into Khalid's question about genetic makeup. So my point is that my genetic makeup is one of a pessimist, but my intellect is forcing me to overcome my pessimism, to spite Patricia Crone, now she's dead, and to spite the Princetonians, and to insist that we are not a defeated people. And it's a struggle, believe me, because, you know, I will sit there and pray to Allah for hours to make me cheerful, although the way Allah created me chemically is not a cheerful person. And as Grace will always tell you, I'm always the half empty, not the half full. She's always the half full.
But not physically. Physically, you're always smiling.
No, just because of you guys. No.
It doesn't matter the reason.
I'm laughing at
it is true. You're always smiling. You're saying the worst things and you're smiling.
Yeah. So it's good to laugh at yourself.
That's good.
But anyway, so this, I mean, I wonder if part of that thing of the early generations and the late generations was in part because the mutakallimun would spend a great deal, and in philosophers as well, would spend a great deal of time talking about, well, how can it be just of God to give rewards and punishments when people are born in such different circumstances. Now, in their language, they always phrased it differently than we would phrase it today, that some people are born the sons and daughters of scholars and of rulers, princes and kings, and in nobility, while others are born into highway robbers or brigands or pirates, and they are, or the sons or daughters of owners of bars, hanat, and the sukr wal arbada, and so. But to summarize a great deal of debate and argument, I think the crux of it is that it is impossible for a just God not to fully take account not just the circumstances, but what God created and coded into you. So I believe that if God has given you the genetic makeup that vis-a-vis what you were given, if we take that fully into account, and you've reached the extent to which, and Ibn Arabi would have reached with the genetic makeup that Ibn Arabi had reached. That the very logic of justice, and again, I'm summarizing a great deal of debate and back and forth and proofs and rational proofs and philosophical proofs and on and on and on. But that when Allah talks about two levels of jinan, that it is impossible, that is simply a matter of your conduct without fully taking into account the entire totality of picture. Because if in the philosophical understanding of justice we take full account, and even in mathematical formulas, as Razi had said himself, that even in mathematical formulas, when we write formulas for mathematics, we code in variables in order to reach proper equations. And a judge is commanded to take variables, and to put it bluntly, justice would never call to punish someone who, alim, like, alim deserves greater punishment if alim goes wrong, not lesser punishment, because alim had much greater opportunities to know. Now, of course, corruption of justice is one where we actually give alim breaks when. So that's what the contextuality thing is. Philosophically and theologically far less problematic in my view, because it would be simply an unjust God not to take the entire contextuality. Now, and so it's not just a matter of higher attainment versus lower attainment without any further ado. I think Allah knows what you struggle against and how much you work with, and the investment in which an individual puts, and whether it's against the grain of their nature or consistent with the grain, and how much opportunities of what gifts God has given them they've wasted, because that's another thing. Because, that's another realm of accountability, is that Allah gives you great level of potential that you throw away. The other thing about eternality of punishment, the qadiyyat al-ta'bid, this actually is among modern Muslims, you don't find it discussed much, but in pre-modern Islam, it was not just debated, but the very meaning of khalidina fiha, or when they say whether hellfire is eternal and whether even heaven is eternal. Now, there are a whole class of theologians that believe that you are in hellfire paying for your sins. So you are there as long as you pay up your bill, so to speak. Now, what is involved in paying your bill? You can either take the literalist route, and you can read the punishments described in various hadiths for various sins, and so you didn't pray, you do your prayers in hellfire. And there are very graphic descriptions in these hadiths about how you're going to make up for the prayers that you didn't pray. And then you pay up your bill, and then once you've paid up, you go to heaven. That was actually the majority opinion until the modern age, which is rather interesting. Again, is it a coincidence that the Wahhabis rejected that opinion? The Wahhabis didn't like the idea of temporality. Although now, I'm seeing a lot of Wahhabi scholars coming back and saying, and emphasizing the hadiths about that eventually everyone will leave hell, and hell will freeze over literally and become cold and deserted, which is a hadith that has been, all the time I spent in Kuwait and Saudi and so on, I've never heard it quoted there until nowadays with the new Wahhabi movement. I've found a lot of Wahhabi scholars now citing to the hadith again. I'll admit to you, I'm not of the school of thought that believes these literal hadiths because of reporting issues. A lot of these hadiths on fitan have huge problems in transmission. But I do believe that whatever the expatriation, that is the form of punishment. Now, we get into much harder questions when we talk about whether heaven has a duration or not. Because many jurists thought it is extremely problematic if heaven has an ending. And that's a mind twister for a lot of modern Muslims, the fact that it was even discussed. The majority opinion is it doesn't, that it is eternal in the sense God is eternal and we don't really understand it, and because we don't understand God's eternity, and there is no real way to understand God's eternity. But there is a significant minority opinion that thought that no, even heaven is not eternal because it would taqdah al-tawheed, that it would create issues for the idea of the unity of God and singularity of God, that nothing is truly eternal except God. And that if human being becomes eternal, then that is a problem for tawheed. Anyway, that in the modern age, you never hear it anymore. So now, to summarize it, don't take for granted the idea that hell is just hell forever. That is the weaker position and the less popular position, if you take the entire duration of Islamic history. And the more supported position is that you pay up your bill. Now, how exactly, Allah knows. Whether Allah will forgive, you pay up, after a certain period of time, Allah will say, okay, enough, I forgive the rest. Allah knows. But my conviction and belief in an absolutely just God is that Allah cannot hold someone with an IQ of 140 or 150 like he holds. I mean, not the IQ is a measure of morality, whatever the measure of morality is, but it's just the genetic coding and the circumstances and some like street children in India or in Egypt or who've never had a chance. It's not street children that get pregnant when they're 12 years old and because they're asleep in the street and they're violated by everyone who no, it's a merciful God cannot have. It's not just like our human with the sense of justice that you see in a court of law, where it's you create general rules and there's no deviations from these rules. If human beings realize the principle of courts of equity at one point and achieve the idea, took them a while, but the notion of mitigating circumstances that must temper the law. You can imagine that, can you imagine how much a priori it applies to God? Okay.
So now can we move on from Surah al Rahman?
We're done with Surah al Rahman.
Okay, so let's take the last couple questions. Then go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Go ahead.
So you mentioned earlier that you can see our auras, and I'm curious if you'd like to at this time give a brief introduction to where that's reflected or revealed, either in the Quran or Islamic history.
And I have one question too.
Keep going. Right there.
This one came in also from.
This is whole auras. There are treatises are written about auras, and they're typically, you can categorize them as within the Sufi tradition, but not exclusively so. There are two people that have written about auras in the Islamic tradition. People who've written about what we would call today black magic, sihr with basically Solomonic magic, sihr Suleiman. And they've written a great deal about auras, but this stuff is dangerous, and I personally am scared of it. And I do believe it's very dangerous. And then the same people who write about the relationship between breathing, blood circulation, and seeing with the inner eye. And this is, it's a, and again, because of modernity, in the rush of quote-unquote Muslim reformers to catch up with modernity, they thought that only rationalism has to be emphasized. And so this was spearheaded by reformers in Egypt, by the rationalists in Egypt and Iran. And of course, leave alone Turkey, but after Ataturk, Turkey sort of became its own thing. And I remember Sheikh Muhammad Ghazali was a student of Sheikh Shaltut. And Sheikh Muhammad Ghazali taught that Sheikh Shaltut, who was a firm believer in rationalism, and he believed in rationalism simply because he said, listen, all the mythology about auras and breathing and the inner eye and all of this, look at the West, look how advanced they are because they rely on science and the scientific method, and our people are backwards and retarded because of all their belief in spirituality and mythology and magic and all that. So Sheikh Shaltut issued a fatwa that it is an affirmative obligation not to teach, to suppress and conceal that literature, even when someone comes and says to you, I want to learn about the breathing, relationship between breathing and the soul, that it's haram to give them references. Now this, of course, Sheikh Shaltut was writing in the early 1900s, and this, I think, unfolded what I'm talking about in the 1930s or something like that. So Sheikh Ghazali was telling us, rahimahullah, that at the time he argued with a sheikh, and to be honest, I don't quite remember, it must have been, it is Shaltut, because I for a second there I thought maybe Sheikh Mahmoud Abdul Halim, but no, it was a Sheikh Shaltut. And he thought that, what right do we have to suppress it? And Sheikh Shaltut told him, because we Muslims have to catch up with civilization and rationalism and scientism and all that. That little exchange is representative up to today. I was listening to the Izat Quran Kareem from Cairo, the Quran radio station from Cairo, and they have all the shuyukh from Azhar that they interview on that radio station. And sheikh after sheikh, they will keep emphasizing that Islam is a religion of reason, that Islam has vanquished khurafat and mythologies, and it doesn't believe in sihr anymore, and that it's haram to talk about, even to the point of nearly coming close to saying, don't read Sufi works. That modernist movement, as well-intentioned as it was, ended up suppressing a lot of the tradition. I mean, it made it into an academic boutique. So there are a few academics here and there that will specialize in this type of literature and will tell you about it. But even till now in Cairo, it's sort of, in Egypt, it's a, even if you're interested in reading this material, you'll have to do it all from underground. Like, it's all hush-hush, because you don't want people to say you're backwards, you're behind, you're superstitious, and so on and so forth. One of the things, once I immigrated to the United States and I no longer worried about having to deal with people who, you know, I'll talk to them about auras 1 second, the next day they'll tell me, oh, I have a jinn who wants to marry me. Because that's what happens back home. I mean, you'll talk to someone about aura and then the next thing they'll come and they've turned crazy on you. In the United States, things are much more, you know, so I've been able to go back and read, to start collecting these treatises and reread them and talk about them, and without worrying too much that people are going to go off the deep end.
Sure, is listening?
Yeah, anyway. So, yeah, the good news is I have been, for now 10 years, downloading, either buying or copying or downloading. When I download it, I actually print it and I bind it. I have an entire collection of about, if you remember, 5 cartons, they're all here, of various treatises in Islamic history that were written just on the relationship between the soul, the respiratory system, the circulatory system, and auras. And my dream is, my initial dream is that if the Usuli Institute got endowments, serious endowments, that I would hire, you would get postgraduate students to work on this material, to edit it, to publish it, and to translate it, because it kills me when I meet people who study the Buddhist tradition and they say, oh, you know, is anything like this in Islam? You have no clue, dude. It's like, you just have no clue. And so, you know, and in the West, if you're interested in actually sort of getting into that book, The Tao of Islam, sort of touches upon this material, and so and it introduces you a little bit to it. But even if in my lifetime, it's not achieved, in my diaries, I talk at length about the various collections. So hopefully, my students can, you know, in the day and when the time comes that they're able to do so, they can read these diaries and say, okay, you know, here's that collection, here's that collection. One of the, I mean, on tape, but I'll say it anyway, but you know this. I also, you and Sharif know, although I'm scared of the black magic material, my fidelity and loyalty to the tradition has made me collect it anyway. And I've collected and I kept it, it's outside the house, you know, it's locked up. I just don't give myself the right to censor it. It's not my, I mean, I have to collect it because it is part of the tradition.
Yeah.
For worse, in the same way that I collect the poetry that is extremely racy, erotic, although, you know, I think it's all haram, but, you know.
It's all haram?
Yeah. I mean, it's not haram to read, but if what they're describing, they actually did,
Teaches the opposite. Teaches the opposite when you learn it.
Yeah, I mean, as poetry, as I said before, I've written in poetry. You know, I've written poetry. I mean, Sharif considers me a poet. I don't consider myself a poet anymore. But I've written about being intoxicated. I've never tasted wine in my life. That's what poets do. They imagine stuff, and they say, "Oh, I'm intoxicated, and I drank wine, and I got drunk and stuff." I've never touched wine the alcohol in my life. But that's what you do as a poet.
I tried hashish once, and people were shocked because I didn't feel anything. And I said, but I feel high without this. I don't need this to feel high. And my mother used to say, Iman gets drunk by water. You know, she doesn't need anything to make her drunk. She's drunk all the time.
That's good.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you. I'm sorry, I have to go. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
On that note,
Assalamu alaikum.
I respect your honesty and bravery. May Allah bless you.
Assalamu alaikum.
So it's 8:22. I
Okay.
have one more question, but we could hold it, and we're waiting for pizza. So we can.
What's the question? It depends on how complex it
This
is.
is the one that I read to you before about. Okay, so this one came in by email, and he wanted to ask if you could comment on how personal lifestyles and circumstances of any scholar necessarily and inevitably impacts the work that they engage in. So Shahab Ahmed with the wine drinking, for example, Foucault's sexuality influenced his own studies on human sexuality. Heidegger cannot be detached from his Nazi background in studying him. So in some, how crucial is it to know an author or scholar's personal background or information in understanding what they argue in their work?
Let's postpone that till next meeting, inshallah, not next week. But so can you reread it?
Sure.
But can I just say one thing about this thing about the all scholars, I don't care who they are, before being a scholar, they're a human being. And it is a fallacy that, and I mean, that's the type of thing I was talking about the allure of academia, is that it has processes. Even the way a book is published by, let's say, Cambridge or Oxford, it's the design, the rigor in making sure there are not a single typo, the quality of the paper, it's all designed to give you a sense of authority, which is fine because I have enormous respect for scholarship, and I've dedicated my entire life to scholarship. But this can never make us lose sight of the fact that all authors, all historians, all jurists, all philosophers are, to one extent or another, a contingent product of the totality of circumstances that has impacted them. I mean, the one that comes closest to me for being sort of an objectified philosopher, in the sense overcoming his personal context and circumstance, is Kant as a philosopher. Not Nietzsche, absolutely not. Not someone like Foucault or someone like Derrida or Gadamer, but even Kant, I can point to a million different things in the narrative of his own history that produced the Kant. And this is so important for because most Muslims buy into, most Muslim graduate students buy into this notion of there's a different, that you can be only a good scholar if you leave your convictional narrative aside or your convictional position aside. That only a secular, quote unquote, because that is also loaded, scholar can be a historian or can truly study Islamic narrative objectively. That is such a fallacy. But I'll stop here because I can go on for hours talking about this. But it is so important for a student to immunize themselves from the beginning against falling into that trap of thinking, well, this is an objective truth, disembodied from any motivators that might tugged at that truth in one way or the other. It's not, but but it's remarkable how when you're in the process itself, you fall victim to it. It's easy for us to say this, but when I am actually reading, okay, the closest one to me is Gadamer and his discourse or tradition. When I just read his erudition, Gadamer. I mean, Kant is beyond erudition. But maybe I'm revealing my own biases. But Gadamer is. But I have to remind myself several times that of what I know about Gadamer's own context, so I am able to maintain a critical, analytical posture towards Gadamer. Now, I've seen students read Patricia Crone or Michael Cook. I've had a Muslim student who read Michael Cook's book on Al-Amr Ma'ruf and Nahy Munkar, commanding the good and forbidding the evil, his 1,000-page study. And this guy, you know, although he knows, by the time he finished the book, it's like Michael Cook is divine. Nothing he said, with all due respect to Michael Cook, and he was one of my teachers at Princeton, you cannot ever abandon your analytical ability simply because you don't have sufficient knowledge as a human being to see the negotiative dynamics that scholar that you're reading has taken in and of himself. I mean, if you have enough knowledge, you can be aware of the choices that Michael Cook made. Choices that he even might have done with the best of intentions, or subconsciously. But if you don't have enough knowledge, then you don't know what these choices are, because you haven't read the text that Michael Cook read. And especially when Michael Cook lays a 1,000-page book on you, in which he's read, how many, have you looked at that book? Hundreds and hundreds of sources. So, but it's important, even if you don't have knowledge of these sources, to always remind yourself, subjectivity is just the human condition.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And inshallah, next halaqa will begin with a new surah. The next surah, inshallah, will be one of the qasar, وَيْلٌ لِكُلِّ هُمَزَةٍ لُمَزَةٍ. And if, I'm always optimistic when it comes to tafsir, if we finish that, we will go on to إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ. But will we get beyond one surah, you think?
Stay tuned to find out.
Just let it happen.
Yeah.
We don't need to say one halaqa, two halaqas.
Okay.
Just
Let it unfold. In the true nature of it, let things unfold.
Yeah.
This is the first time in my life I've been called a smiley person. I should give her an award. See,
Yeah, I didn't want to say anything.
did you realize you're married to a cheerful, smiley person?
Because you've been hanging out with me too long.